At 0750 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Admiral Chuchi Nagumo stood on the flag bridge of the carrier Akagi and gave an order that would outlive every ship in his fleet, every man under his command, and every strategic plan his nation had constructed since the beginning of the war. He did not know that yet. From where he stood, surrounded by the thrum of ventilation fans and the smell of aviation fuel drifting up from a hangar deck below, the order seemed not just reasonable but necessary. The American torpedo bombers were coming in low off the horizon, wave after wave of them, slow and obsolete, and dying in great numbers against the Zero fighters circling above the fleet. His strike force, 108 aircraft, sat on the hangar decks of 4 carriers armed with land attack bombs, loaded for a second strike against the island of Midway, 8 miles to the southwest. Intelligence had just reported that an American surface force was in the area. The nature of that force, whether it included carriers, was unknown. Nagumo made his decision: rearm the aircraft, replace the land attack bombs with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs designed for use against ships. The order went down to the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu at 0758. It would take, his ordnance crews estimated, approximately 90 minutes to complete the rearm. 90 minutes. The entire course of the Pacific War would balance on what happened inside that window. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why that order was catastrophic, you have to understand who gave it and what he had already done. Chuchi Nagumo was 54 years old in June of 1942. He had spent his career as a torpedo and surface warfare specialist, not an aviator. He had never learned to fly. He had never commanded a carrier before 1941, when Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assigned him to lead Kido Butai, the first air fleet, the most powerful carrier strike force ever assembled. Nagumo was selected not because he was the Navy's most visionary thinker, but because he was its most senior eligible flag officer. Yamamoto's preference had been Vice Admiral Isaburo Ozawa, a man who understood carrier aviation intuitively. The assignment went to Nagumo instead, and Nagumo had justified the choice on the morning of December 7, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was a masterpiece of operational planning and execution. Kido Butai had sortied from Haido Kappa Bay in the Kuril Islands on November 26, maintaining strict radio silence across 3,400 miles of the North Pacific. 6 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carried 353 aircraft and nearly 10,000 men. The first wave launched at 0600 local time from a point 230 miles north of Oahu. Torpedo bombers skimmed the wave tops toward Battleship Row at 150 feet. Dive bombers peeled away toward the airfields at Wheeler and Hickam. Fighters swept ahead to suppress any American interceptors. In less than 2 hours, Nagumo's aviators sank or damaged 18 American warships, destroyed 188 aircraft, and killed 2,403 Americans. They lost 29 aircraft and 64 men. By any military measure, it was the most successful naval airstrike in history up to that moment. But Nagumo made a decision at Pearl Harbor that would echo forward to Midway. He launched 2 strike waves, and then he turned north and took his fleet home. He did not launch a 3rd wave to destroy the repair facilities, the dry docks, the fuel tank farms, and the submarine base at Pearl Harbor. His aviators had requested it. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda, who had led the strike, pressed the case aboard Akagi's flag bridge. The fuel storage tanks alone held 4.5 million barrels of oil. Destroying them would have paralyzed the Pacific Fleet for years, not months. Nagumo declined. His aircraft were returning damaged. His own fleet had not been detected yet, and he did not want to press his luck. He was, above all, a cautious man. The caution had served him through 6 months of unbroken Japanese victories. Pearl Harbor, Rabaul, Darwin, Colombo, the Indian Ocean raid in April of 1942, where his carriers sank the British heavy cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall, and the carrier Hermes in a single day of operations. Wherever Kido Butai had appeared, the enemy had been destroyed or driven away. By May of 1942, the first air fleet had sailed more than 50,000 miles and had not lost a single carrier. In 6 months of war, Nagumo had become accustomed to a world in which Japanese carrier aviation was invincible. That was a belief, the doctrine he carried inside him, when he sailed east toward Midway in late May of 1942. Yamamoto's plan for the Midway operation was characteristically complex. The invasion of Midway Atoll would serve as bait to draw the American Pacific Fleet into a decisive engagement where Japan's overwhelming numerical superiority could annihilate it. Nagumo's Kido Butai, now 4 carriers, having detached Shokaku and Zuikaku for repairs after the Battle of the Coral Sea, would neutralize Midway's air defenses before the amphibious landing force arrived. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu together carried 248 aircraft and represented the finest concentration of naval air power in the world. Against them, the Americans could muster, Yamamoto estimated, no more than 1 or 2 carriers, possibly none. American carrier strength had been badly damaged at the Coral Sea. The Lexington was gone. The Yorktown had been badly damaged. Japanese naval intelligence assessed the odds as heavily in Japan's favor. What Japanese naval intelligence did not know was that the Americans had broken their operational code. JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's main cipher, had been partially cracked by Station HYPO, the code-breaking unit at Pearl Harbor under Commander Joseph Rockefort. By late May of 1942, Rockefort and his team had identified enough of the Midway operations framework to allow Admiral Chester Nimitz to position his forces in ambush. 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were already waiting northeast of Midway when Nagumo's fleet arrived. The Japanese had come looking for a decisive battle on their terms. They were sailing into one on American terms instead. Nagumo reached his launch point, 240 miles northwest of Midway. In the early morning darkness of June 4, at 0430, he began launching the first strike wave, 108 aircraft, 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers converted to carry bombs, 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters. Their mission was straightforward: destroy Midway's airfields, gun emplacements, and command facilities so thoroughly that the island could not threaten the invasion fleet. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the formation southwest toward Midway. Back aboard Akagi, Nagumo held his second strike reserve. 102 aircraft remained on the carrier decks and in the hangars, armed, fueled, and waiting. Their armament was specific. The bombers carried Type 99 land attack bombs and Type 800 kilogram bombs, ordnance designed to penetrate concrete and destroy fixed installations. They were there in case Tomonaga's first wave did not finish the job. They were there because Midway had to be silenced before the invasion transports arrived. And they were there because Nagumo, consistent with the doctrine he had followed since December, wanted a second wave available to continue the bombardment if needed. At 0530, Midway's radar picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft at a distance of 93 miles. Every flyable aircraft on the island launched immediately. Marine fighters, obsolete Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, climbed to intercept. Marine and Army bombers headed for the Japanese fleet. The island's anti-aircraft batteries manned their weapons and waited. Tomonaga's strike hit Midway at 0630 and found the island's defenses intact and furious. The Marine fighters, though badly outclassed by the escorting Zeros, threw themselves into the Japanese formation. 17 American aircraft were shot down in the first 10 minutes, but the airfields absorbed the bombs and the runways remained usable. The fuel storage, the command post, the seaplane hangar, all were hit, but none were destroyed beyond use. Tomonaga circled the burning island and sent a radio message back to Akagi. It reached the flag bridge at 0705. The text was direct. A second strike against Midway was necessary. Nagumo read the message in the flag plot. He stood at the chart table with his chief of staff, Rear Admiral Ryanosu Kasaka, and his fleet operations officer, Commander Minoru Genda. Genda was one of the architects of the Pearl Harbor strike and the finest operational mind in Japanese naval aviation. He was also suffering from influenza that morning, fighting a fever that left him pale and hollowed out, but present nonetheless. The 3 men talked through the situation. Tomonaga needed a second strike against Midway. The reserve aircraft on the hangar decks were armed for that purpose. The math seemed clear. But there was a complication. At 05:45, a scout plane from the cruiser Tone had reported what it described as 10 surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway, moving southeast at more than 20 knots. The report was ambiguous. 10 surface ships. The scout had not identified the ship types. He had not said whether there were carriers among them. Nagumo read the report and read it again. His doctrine was explicit. Before any major rearm decision, he needed to know whether those ships included carriers. If the American force had carriers, his strike reserve needed to remain armed with ship attack ordnance, torpedoes, and armor-piercing bombs. If the American force had no carriers, he could safely rearm for a second strike on Midway. He ordered the Tone Scout, plane number 4, to investigate further and report the ship types. At 07:15, before plane number 4 had reported back, the first of Midway's land-based bombers found the Japanese fleet. 6 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers from Midway attacked at low altitude. The Zeros shot down 5 of them. The 6 escaped, damaged, without scoring a hit. For Army Air Forces B, 26 Marauders followed, also carrying torpedoes. 2 were shot down. None hit. Then 16 Marine Corps Dauntless dive bombers made a high-altitude attack. All returned without scoring a hit. Then 15 Army B, 17 Flying Fortresses dropped bombs from 20,000 feet. No hits. The American attacks were brave and almost entirely ineffective. Nagumo watched his Zero fighters destroy them methodically. The American aircraft were obsolete, their pilots inadequately trained for anti-shipping attacks, their tactics poorly suited to attacking a fleet defended by the finest fighter pilots in the Pacific. But the sheer number of attacks confirmed one thing in Nagumo's mind. Midway's air forces were not yet neutralized. Tomonaga was right. A second strike was needed. At 07:15, while the last American bombers were still being chased away by Zeros, Nagumo made his decision. He would rearm the second strike aircraft. The land attack bombs that were already loaded would be removed. The aircraft would be rearmed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs only if the Tone Scout confirmed enemy carriers were present. Otherwise, the second wave would go back to Midway with land attack ordnance. He issued the rearm order at 07:58. On the hangar decks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, ordnance crews went to work. The rearm process was not simple. Removing a land attack bomb from a Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber required releasing for locking clamps, lowering the weapon on its cradle, rolling it to the bomb stowage area, and then mounting either a torpedo or an armor-piercing bomb in its place. The torpedoes alone weighed 1,760 pounds each and required precise alignment with the aircraft's centerline release mechanism. Under ideal conditions, with a full ordnance crew working efficiently, the process took approximately 90 minutes per aircraft. Doing it simultaneously across 4 carriers, for more than 90 aircraft, meant moving hundreds of heavy weapons through crowded hangar decks, while aircraft engines were being serviced, fueled, and spotted for the upcoming launch. The disassembled bombs were placed on the hangar deck, not stowed in the magazines below, not locked in their armored storage racks, set down on the wooden hangar deck in the interest of speed, because there was no time to take them back down to magazine and return them later. The decision to leave the bombs on a hangar deck rather than strike them below to the magazine was not Nagumo's alone. It reflected the speed pressure of the moment, the certainty that the rearm would be completed, and the aircraft launched before any threat materialized. It was the kind of shortcut that works perfectly right up until the moment it does not. At 08:09, 11 minutes after the rearm order, plane number 4 sent its second report. The enemy force included what appeared to be a carrier. Nagumo read the message, and his world contracted. A carrier. The one thing his doctrine had told him to watch for. If the Americans had a carrier, everything changed. A carrier meant American dive bombers. A carrier meant torpedo bombers. A carrier meant that his own fleet, crowded with rearming aircraft and loose ordnance on the hangar decks, was the target, not Midway. He ordered Kasaka and Genda to evaluate the situation. The discussion lasted minutes, not hours. The options were narrow. He could launch a strike force immediately in its half-rearmed state. Some aircraft with torpedoes, some still carrying land attack bombs, without proper fighter escort because the Zeros were still returning from Midway defense duties and needed to refuel. Or he could wait for Tomonaga's first wave to return and recover, res-pot the deck, complete the rearm properly, and launch a coordinated full-strength strike. The first option meant a fragmented, poorly coordinated attack. The second meant delay. Nagumo chose the second. He suspended the rearm at 0813 and ordered the fleet to recover Tomonaga's returning aircraft before launching the strike against the American carriers. The fleet turned into the wind. What Nagumo did not know, what no one aboard any Japanese carrier knew that morning, was that the three American carriers were not 240 miles away. They were closer. Enterprise and Hornet were positioned northeast of the Japanese fleet at a distance of approximately 150 miles. Yorktown was further north, but closing. And at 0702, more than an hour before Nagumo issued his rearm order, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, had already ordered the American strike launched. Enterprise and Hornet had begun launching at 0702. Their air groups were already in the air, already flying southwest toward the Japanese fleet, already committed to the attack before Nagumo had even finished reading Tomonaga's request for a second Midway strike. The Americans were already coming. The rearm order had been given in ignorance of that fact, and now, as Nagumo waited for Tomonaga's aircraft to land and for the ordnance crews to complete their work, his carriers were operating in the most vulnerable condition possible. Decks crowded, magazines open, loose ordnance on the hangar floors, fighters at low altitude refueling, and 100 miles to the northeast, American dive bombers were crossing the sky toward him. At 0917 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the first of Midway's torpedo bombers found the Japanese fleet. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet arrived first. 15 Douglas TBD Devastators, the oldest torpedo bomber in the American inventory, flying at 150 feet above the wave tops at 100 knots. Their pilots knew the odds. The Devastator had been obsolete since 1940. Its maximum speed was slower than a Zero in level flight by 60 miles an hour. Its single-forward firing 30-caliber machine gun was nearly useless in combat. Its Mark 13 aerial torpedo required a drop at under 300 feet altitude and under 115 knots airspeed, which meant the pilot had to hold straight and level flight, no evasion, no maneuvering, from the moment he committed his attack run until the torpedo left the aircraft. The Zeros would have a minimum of 45 seconds of fire at an aircraft that could not dodge. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led Torpedo 8. He had separated from the main Hornet Air Group during the transit, following his own navigation estimate rather than the group commander's, and had found the Japanese fleet alone, without fighter escort, without dive bomber support. He pressed the attack anyway. His 15 aircraft flew into a wall of Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. In the next 7 minutes, every Devastator in Torpedo 8 was shot down. 15 aircraft, 30 men. One survived. Ensign George Gay, floating in the water beneath a seat cushion, watching the battle unfold around him. Torpedo 8 scored 0 hits. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise arrived minutes later. 14 Devastators, also without fighter escort, also flying into the Zero defensive screen. 10 were shot down. The survivors released their torpedoes. 0 hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown came in from a different bearing. 12 aircraft, 2 fighters as escort. 10 Devastators shot down. 0 hits. In approximately 40 minutes, the 3 American torpedo squadrons flew 41 aircraft into the Japanese fleet's defenses and scored 0 torpedo hits. They lost 35 aircraft and 69 men. By any tactical measure, the torpedo attacks had failed completely, but they had done something that no one, not the American planners, not the Japanese defenders, and not the dying torpedo bomber crews themselves, had intended. They had pulled every Zero in the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to wave-top altitude. The Zeros defending Kido Butai were the finest fighter aircraft in the Pacific in June of 1942. The Mitsubishi A6M2 could reach 331 miles an hour in level flight. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7 minutes. It could turn inside any American fighter at almost any speed. And it was flown by men who had been flying combat since the China campaigns of the late 1930s. Pilots with thousands of hours. Men who had been killing enemies in the air since before most of their American counterparts had soloed. against the devastators. They were merciless and precise. They dove from altitude, made their firing passes, pulled up, and dove again. By the time the last torpedo bomber had been shot down or driven off, the Zero pilots had expended ammunition and fuel and had descended to altitudes between 200 and 2,000 feet, chasing the low, slow attackers across the wave tops. The combat air patrol that was supposed to defend the fleet at altitude was now strung out at sea level, reforming, climbing, trying to regain the altitude that doctrine required for fleet defense. At 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Clarence McCluskey led 37 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise over an empty ocean. He had been searching for the Japanese fleet for 40 minutes after reaching the estimated intercept point and finding nothing. His aircraft were burning fuel they could not afford to lose. He made a decision, turn northwest, follow the wake of a Japanese destroyer he had spotted below running north at high speed, and trust that it was heading toward the main fleet. It was. At 10:22, McCluskey's formation crossed over the Japanese fleet at 14,000 feet and saw what was below them. 4 carriers. Their decks crowded. Aircraft spotted on the flight decks, fueled and armed. The Zeros, almost all of them, were down at wave-top altitude or climbing to the lower altitudes after the torpedo bomber attacks, not yet back to 14,000 feet. The sky above the Japanese carriers was, for a window of minutes that would close very quickly, nearly empty of defending fighters. If you find the story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. McCluskey split his force. He assigned his own squadron to Kaga, the largest carrier, and Lieutenant Richard Best's squadron to Akagi. Simultaneously, 17 dauntless dive bombers from Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, rolled into their dives on Soryu. 3 carrier air groups, attacking 3 different carriers, within minutes of each other, from altitudes the Japanese combat air patrol had abandoned. The dive bombers pushed over at 10:22. The Dauntless entered its attack dive at around 250 miles an hour, steepening towards 70 degrees as the pilot tracked his target to the reflector sight. From 14,000 feet, the dive lasted approximately 40 seconds. In those 40 seconds, the pilot held the crosshairs on the carrier's flight deck while the world tilted and the target grew from a gray rectangle to a structure he could see in detail. The island, the flight deck markings, the aircraft spotted on the deck, the men running below. He had to hold the dive angle, hold the sight picture, and release at approximately 2,000 feet before pulling out with enough altitude to avoid the blast of his own bomb. The first bomb hit Kaga at 10:24. Then 2 more. Then a 4th. Kaga's flight deck was packed with aircraft that had returned from Midway and had not yet been struck below. Aircraft that were being refueled and rearmed in the open. The bombs detonated among them. Aviation gasoline ignited. Torpedoes that had been removed from aircraft during the rearm and left on the hangar deck, not yet returned to magazine. Cooked off in the heat, bombs that had been removed from aircraft and stacked on the hangar deck joined the chain of detonations. Kaga's damage control parties fought the fires for 2 hours before the order to abandon ship was given. She sank at 19:25 that evening. 800 men died. Akagi took 2 bomb hits. 2 bombs, out of the entire spread, dropped by McCluskey's squadron. One pierced the flight deck and detonated in the upper hangar, among the aircraft spotted there for the strike. The second hit the edge of the flight deck, near the midship elevator. The fires that followed were fed by the same combination of factors that had doomed Kaga: loose torpedoes, unretracted bombs, aviation gasoline lines that had not been drained or isolated before the rearm began. The fires reached the torpedo storage area. At 10:46, a series of internal explosions blew out Akagi's hangar deck. Nagumo transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara at 10:46, standing on Akagi's bridge as the fires consumed her decks, refusing initially to leave, until his staff physically convinced him that the flagship could not be saved. Akagi burned through the day and was scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 0500 the following morning. 267 men died. Soryu absorbed 3 bomb hits in the space of 20 seconds. Her hangar deck erupted. Her engine rooms lost power. She was dead in the water at 10:25, 1 minute after the attack began. She sank at 1913, taking 718 men down with her. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, had been hit within approximately 5 minutes. All 3 were fatally damaged. The aggregate loss in those 5 minutes was 3 fleet carriers, somewhere between 200 and 250 aircraft, and crews totaling in the thousands. The Japanese strike force that had planned to destroy the American carriers was itself destroyed, on the decks and in the hangars, before a single aircraft could be launched against the enemy. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been positioned several miles to the north of the main group and was not attacked in the initial strike. Her captain, Tomio Kaku, and the division commander aboard, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, saw the smoke columns rising from the other 3 carriers and immediately ordered a counterstrike. Yamaguchi was one of the most aggressive and talented flag officers in the Japanese Navy. He had been identified by many as a future commander-in-chief, and he wasted no time. At 10:58, 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros launched from Hiryu. They found Yorktown at noon. 3 bombs hit. Yorktown's boilers were knocked out. She lost speed and began listing. American damage control teams worked with extraordinary efficiency. Within an hour, they had patched 3 of the 6 boiler rooms back into service, corrected the list by counterflooding, and brought Yorktown back up to 19 knots. When Hiryu's second strike arrived, 10K torpedo bombers at 1400 hours, the Japanese pilots initially mistook Yorktown for an undamaged carrier because the damage control team had repaired her so thoroughly. 2 torpedoes hit. Yorktown lost power again, listed heavily, and was abandoned. She would be kept afloat for another day before a Japanese submarine found her and put 2 more torpedoes into her hull on the morning of June 6. She sank at 01:58 on June 7. But Hiryu did not outlive her victims by long. At 1700 hours on June 4, 24 Enterprise dive bombers found her, for bombs hit in rapid succession. Her fires reached the same combination of loose ordnance and open fuel lines that had destroyed the other 3 carriers. Hiryu burned through the night. Her captain and Yamaguchi remained aboard voluntarily as she went down. Yamaguchi sent a final message to his surviving crew members as they left the ship. He told them that he would answer to the Emperor for the loss of the carrier from the bridge. Both men went down with Hiryu at 09:10 on the morning of June 5. Yamaguchi was 49 years old. In less than 24 hours, the Japanese Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 248 carrier aircraft, and approximately 3,500 men, including a disproportionate share of the most experienced naval aviators in the world. The aircrew losses were in some ways more damaging than the ship losses. Japan could build new carriers, and did, but it could not quickly replace pilots who had been flying and fighting since China. The training pipeline that produced a carrier aviator in the Imperial Japanese Navy required years, not months. The men who died at Midway had been accumulating that experience since the middle 1930s. Their replacements, however brave, would go into combat with a fraction of the flight hours and none of the combat experience. Nagumo was relieved of command of the 1st Air Fleet in the weeks following Midway. He was not court-martialed. He was not publicly disgraced. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not practice the kind of public accountability that might have demanded a formal reckoning with what had happened. Instead, the Midway defeat was classified. The public was not told the truth. The official communiques described a great Japanese victory, the sinking of the carrier Yorktown and 1 destroyer, at the cost of 1 carrier and 35 aircraft. The families of 3,500 dead men received no explanation of how or why their relatives had died. Nagumo went on to command other formations. He led Japanese naval forces during the Guadalcanal campaign later in 1942, where his decisions during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, including the strikes that damaged the Enterprise and sank the Hornet, partially restored his reputation within the Navy. But the reputation was a ghost. The men who had been there knew what had happened at Midway. Genda knew. Kosaka knew. The surviving aircrew knew. The 7-minute window between 07:58, when the rearm order went out, and 08:13, when plane number 4's report forced Nagumo to reconsider and freeze the process, had broken something that could not be repaired. The historical argument over whether Nagumo's decisions at Midway were reasonable given what he knew at the time, or catastrophically wrong, given what he should have known, has occupied naval historians for more than 80 years. The case for Nagumo is not trivial. He had received ambiguous intelligence. His scout plane had failed to identify ship types for nearly an hour after initial contact. He was operating doctrine that had been correct in every previous engagement. Tomonaga's first strike report genuinely indicated that Midway needed a second attack. The American carriers were closer than his intelligence suggested they should have been, which itself reflected the intelligence failure at the highest levels of Japanese planning. The failure to account for the possibility that the Americans had broken Gen 25. Nagumo did not know he was sailing into an ambush. He did not know that Fletcher and Spruance were waiting for him. He made decisions based on information that was incomplete in ways he could not have fully recognized. But the case against him is heavier. A more aggressive commander, Yamaguchi, who from Hiryu's bridge had signaled Nagumo at 0830 to launch the strike force immediately with whatever armament the aircraft currently carried, without waiting for the rearm to complete. Would have gotten aircraft into the air before the American dive bombers arrived. Yamaguchi's signal was refused. Nagumo chose the doctrine of the coordinated, properly armed, full-strength strike over the doctrine of speed. He chose the certainty of preparation over the risk of improvisation. At every previous engagement, that choice had been correct. At Midway, it was fatal, because the Americans were already in the air and the window for a properly prepared strike had already closed without Nagumo knowing it. The bombs themselves, the land attack ordnance that had been stripped from the aircraft during the rearm and left on the hangar decks rather than struck below to magazines, were, in the end, as dangerous to the Japanese fleet as the American dive bombers. The decision to leave them on the hangar deck was a consequence of speed pressure, of trying to complete the rearm as quickly as possible, of the assumption that there would be time enough to do it properly before any threat materialized. That assumption, built from 6 months of unbroken success, from the certainty that Kido Butai was invincible and that the enemy could not reach them before they were ready, caused 4 carriers. The ordnance on the hangar decks became the fuel that fed the fires the American bombs started. The carriers did not simply sink from bomb damage. They burned from within, fed by their own weapons. The deeper historical irony of Midway is that it was not primarily won by superior American technology or superior American airmanship, though both were present. It was won because the codebreakers at Station HYPO had given Nimitz enough information to position his carriers where Yamamoto's plan had not expected to find them, and because the torpedo bomber crews, the men of Torpedo 8 and Torpedo 6 and Torpedo 3, who flew obsolete aircraft into certain death and scored not a single hit, had pulled the Japanese Combat Air Patrol down to wave-top altitude at exactly the moment the dive bombers arrived from altitude. The torpedo bomber attacks succeeded through failure. Their deaths created the gap that the dive bombers flew through. Nagumo survived the war longer than the fleet he had commanded. He was assigned in early 1944 to command the Central Pacific Area Fleet and the 14th Army Air Force, a paper command over mostly ground forces, the kind of assignment given officers whose careers had effectively ended. He was on Saipan when the American invasion began in June of 1944. The island was defended by roughly 32,000 Japanese Army and Navy troops. The American force that came ashore numbered in excess of 70,000. The defense lasted 24 days. On July 7, 1944, the remnants of the Japanese garrison launched the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War, approximately 4,000 men attacking American lines at 04:45 in the morning. Most died within hours. Nagumo did not lead that charge. On July 6, the day before the final assault, he was found dead in a cave on the northern end of the island. He had committed suicide with a pistol. He was 57 years old. His chief of staff at Midway, Kusaka, survived the war. Commander Genda, the brilliant operational planner who had been sick with influenza on Akagi's flag bridge during those critical morning hours, survived the war and went on to serve in the post-war Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, retiring as a general. He lived until 1989. The wreck of Akagi was found in October of 2019 by a research team from the research vessel Petrel, funded by the estate of Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. She lies at approximately 18,000 feet, more than 3 miles below the surface of the Pacific, 300 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Kaga was found nearby. The wrecks are protected under United States law as the graves of the men who died inside them. At those depths, in that darkness, they are undisturbed. The Midway battlefield in the narrowest sense lasted less than 6 hours, from Toranaga's launch before dawn to Hireu's fatal bombing late in the afternoon. But the consequences unfurled across the remaining 3 years of the Pacific War in ways that shaped every campaign that followed. After Midway, Japan retained numerical superiority in surface warships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, for another year. But she never again had the combination of carriers, aircraft, and experienced aviators that had made Kido Butai the most powerful naval air strike force in the world. Every major Japanese naval offensive after Midway was conducted from a position of air inferiority that the loss of those 4 carriers and their air crews had created. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, where American fighters destroyed 376 Japanese aircraft in a single day in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was in part a consequence of what had happened at Midway 2 years earlier. The experienced aircrew dead, the training pipeline unable to replace them, the replacements going into combat with hundreds of flight hours instead of thousands. Nagumo's rearm order at 0758 has become one of the most analyzed tactical decisions in the literature of naval warfare. It was not irrational. It was not stupid. It was a reasonable response to incomplete information by a commander who had been given no reason, across 6 months of war, to doubt his own doctrine. What made it catastrophic was a combination of factors that converged on that single morning. The American codebreakers who had positioned the ambush, the torpedo bomber crews who created the zero gap with their deaths, the scout plane that was an hour late reporting the enemy carrier, the bombs left on the hangar decks in the name of speed, and the unshakable confidence that came from 6 months of victories, the confidence that told Nagumo there was time to do it right, that the enemy could not reach him before he was ready, that Kido Butai was beyond the reach of any force the Americans could bring against it. That confidence was the most dangerous thing Nagumo carried onto Akiji's flag bridge on the morning of June 4, 1942. It had been earned in combat, confirmed by results, built into the doctrine of the First Air Fleet from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, and it was wrong in the specific conditions of that specific morning in a way that no single decision, however different, could have fully corrected, because the Americans were already in the air before the rearm order was given, already committed to the attack, already past the point of no return. The window had already closed. Nagumo did not know that when he gave the order. He never fully knew it afterward. The carriers burned and the pilots died, and the war turned in a direction from which Japan never recovered, all within a morning whose first hours had looked, from the flag bridge of Akiji, very much like every other morning of the war. 7 minutes, 0758 to 0813. The duration of the rearm order before plane number 4's report forced a suspension. In that window, the hangar decks of 4 carriers were opened, the ordnance was redistributed. The bombs were left on the deck, and the machinery of the disaster was set in motion. 7 minutes, whose consequences took 3 more years and hundreds of thousands of lives to fully arrive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.